its greatest failure, which it doesn't recognize, was to provide very powerful incentives for Russia and China to become very deep partners. Let's go back a bit in history. The United States was born in what I believe was a state of original virtue. And the United States, and the founders of the United States in the late 18th century, believed that they were creating something entirely new, unique in the world. And in some sense, it was. A political system based upon the principle of popular sovereignty, multi-democratic representative institutions, and so forth. That was unique in the world at the time. And so the United Americans have always been very self-conscious about what they believe to be their exceptionalism and, in some sense, the superiority in terms of political virtue. And there's always been a great underlying, or two versions of how this might express itself in regard to the rest of the world, either as an example, as a model of what could be accomplished, or as an agent, or actually as a combination of the two. You know, the former notion is associated with first presented by George Washington in his farewell address. And he spoke explicitly, the United States should avoid the great power games, the entangling alliances of the old world, wanted to separate itself from that and believed that it could. At the same time, over the course of the 19th century, the United States did pursue an expansionist policy in North America. It started the war with Mexico in 1848, which was a war of conquest. Started the war on a flimsy pretext against Spain in 1898, and so on. But the country as a whole did not see itself as having global ambitions until World War I came. And of course, after World War I, there was well-known reversion from a global role in leadership of the United States had by that time become the dominant financial power and played a significant role with reparations and all of that after the war. The great sea change came with World War II. And after World War II, with the post-WWII era, the United States as a whole, leaders and populists accepted like it was a world power. But it thought of itself as a world power with good intentions that would create what the social scientists call public goods. And that is conditions that would serve everybody's interest, not just the self-interest of the United States. And of course, the two, in American minds, merged. So therefore, what was an American self-interest was also the world's interest. And so the United States became a global power with it, at that time, and the Cold War, etc. After the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a way, the question, reopened itself. What would the United States position in the world? There were very few voices saying that we should retreat again or greatly diminish our world presence. Instead, what you got was a dedication to a far-reaching program to promote liberal values, political and economic, across the expanse of the former Soviet Union and around the world. And this conformed very nicely to American philosophy, American ideals, and so forth. There was also a hard-nosed realpolitik aspect to it. And there were, if you want to see a seminal document of this realpolitik version of an American commitment to reshaping the world in its own image, you look at the famous memorandum called Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz, you recognize that name? He was a figure in the Defense Department. He was a leader of the group of the school of thought we now call the neoconservatives or neocons. He wrote a memorandum in February of 1991, in which he laid out in detail and outlined a comprehensive program for what today we would call American hegemony. And he said this was a unique historical opportunity to achieve one, complete security for the United States, two, the predominance almost globally of American and Western values in Western style institutions, political and economic, and so forth. And as part of this, the United States has to be actively engaged in every region of the world. And the Wolfowitz doctrine, if you want to call it that, argued in very traditional power political terms, not in traditional American idealist terms. You had this merger, this convergence of both the idealistic strain. The United States was going to lighten the path, shed light on the path of enlightenment and democratic institutions and prosperity and international cooperation. And the West would be the custodians of the United States, of this, and the United States would be the lead agent. That was the idealistic version. The Wolfowitz version, and the followers, who have since prevailed, was the United States simply has to use its predominant power to create this world. And that meant, one, preventing any rival from arising that could challenge the United States. And this might entail diplomatic, political, economic action, and also coercive military action. And that's where the idea came of not just preemptive war, but preventive war. And that is to use coercive means, whether they be military or otherwise, depending on the circumstances and the region and so forth, to prevent the emergence of any hostile nation or grouping of nations who could oppose and resist and thwart this grand American strategy. One expression of this was in NATO enlargement. And NATO enlargement from the very beginning was predicated on the notion that Russia was a separate entity and should not be included, or should not be included in what would become pan-European institutions, which is Gorbachev and subsequent Russian leaders, actually down to Mr. Putin, and always urged and expected. But instead, you get this NATO alliance, and these other European countries were absorbed into NATO and its accompanying economic and political collective institutions. And Russia was to be kept marginalized and weak. At best, it would be like a country cousin, which is an American phrase, I guess. A second-class citizen in the future, and economically, of course, everybody desired its vast natural resources. Over time, this was 1991. At the time that it was leaked, it was thought to be embarrassing. I was in Paris at the time giving a talk at the French military, and President then George W.H. Bush, the elder Bush, publicly said, no, this is not American policy, and so on. What's happened over the ensuing 30-odd years is that the Wolfowitz view of the world and conception of American global interest and American strategy has prevailed and is now pervasive. And almost all of the American foreign policy community bases their thinking on premises that were built into and underlay and were the foundation of the Wolfowitz doctrine. which means that the United States, in the thinking, American sort of, geostrategic policymakers and Pentagon as well, because the Pentagon actually developed their own version of this, which was to have escalation dominance in every region of the world, including Central Asia. Even Hillary Clinton at one point talked about making Afghanistan an American leaning, adopted stumbling block to the Belt and Road Initiative. And the United States at that time, in the 2000s, was very active, trying to win over Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and the Stan is absolutely absurd, of course. That gives an indication of how expansive were these ambitions and the conception of what would represent American hegemony, which is increasingly divorced from reality, increasingly improbable of success, which has produced failure after failure, but which now still maintains its hold on the thinking of the US government. I'm kind of simplifying things somewhat. So the big question is, one of the implications, and how do you get out of this trap? Go back to the failures. The United States, in terms of interventions in the Middle East, it failed in Iraq and caused incredible havoc in the region. Iraq just wants the United States to get off its territory now. It failed in Syria. It failed ignominiously in Afghanistan. And of course, those failures in the Middle East are now becoming much deeper and deeper because of this quite illogical willingness to act as an accomplice to Israel, which has lost it, as you know. I mean, much of its standing in the world, certainly its moral standing, etc., outside of the West, as rather narrowly defined. And of course, its greatest failure, which it doesn't recognize, was to provide very powerful incentives for Russia and China to become very deep partners. I mean, after all, the opening to China in 1972 was meant to deepen the divisions between the Soviet Union and China. And to some extent, it worked. So that was a very complicated triangle. In a less dramatic way, it would certainly be in the United States' interest in any conventional, traditional, strategic thinking, at least not to encourage Russia and China to become close partners. Until very recently, the United States did entertain the idea that it could keep them separate, even after it became evident that their interests were converging. Their primary common interest being to prevent American domination. Well, obviously. So they even under President Biden, before the Ukraine war, Secretary, not Biden himself, Secretary Blinken, went to Moscow and in effect said to the Russians, look, you guys should really be afraid of the Chinese. Look how strong they are, their vast economy. You have all these empty lands in Siberia and so forth. And don't forget the Mongols and so forth. You'd be very careful. Why don't you simply hang around with us? Of course, you'd be in a subordinate position. We'd offered them nothing in the way of serious incentives, the Russians. And of course, the Russian response was, "You crazy, go to hell." In polite language. But the fact that the American leaders retained in these fantasies right up to a few years ago, is hard evidence of how divorced American strategic thinking has become, divorced from reality. And then, its messages to, your government in China have been equally unrealistic, And this hasn't been really very, very professional. I mean, this constant, the constant refrain that you state publicly, the United States recognizes the one China principle, or the United States does everything it can to secure Taiwan's autonomy and independence. I mean, this is childish. It's not just ineffectual. I mean, you'd have to believe that the Chinese leadership are absolute what? I mean, low IQ, idiots to not see the contradiction. So as the United States has become locked into this deeply flawed and impossible strategy of subduing its rivals in Russia and China as absolutely necessary to maintain and extend American global dominance, it's accompanied by a very unprofessional diplomacy. The United States, as Ambassador Freeman, Chas Freeman, has said many times frequently, he says the United States does not conduct diplomacy anymore. It issues, it takes unilateral action. Well, it issues demands, gives instructions, and so forth. Now, that's the situation we're in. Now, I have a few ideas of my own.